Welcome to the Reinvention Collaborative's Town Hall featuring Dr. Michael Crow, President of Arizona State University, and hosted and moderated by our RC colleague, Dr. Fred Corey, Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education at ASU. I'm Steve Dandino, Executive Director of the Reinvention Collaborative. Along with Liz Bennett and Jenna Anderson of the RC Home Office, we'd like to welcome colleagues from around the country and share that our one-hour format is straightforward. Participants should use the Q&A function in Zoom to post questions during President Crow's remarks, and Dr. Corey will pose them singly or in combination as time permits. Please state your name and your institution, if you would, when typing your question. This town hall is being recorded and will be posted to the MyRC, the Reinvention Collaborative's online community. If I may add briefly a reminder of our purpose, recall that President Crow is the co-author with William B. Dabars of a new Johns Hopkins University book entitled The Fifth Wave, The Evolution of American Higher Education, which is a follow-up, as you know, to their well-known 2015 Designing the New American University. As you can all imagine, what it must be like to work on a book for years and then right as it's published, extraordinary events occur which may cast its themes and arguments in perhaps a bit of a new light. When we offer this opportunity for President Crow to relate the fifth wave to the health and economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as to the emergent struggle against systemic racism in the US and around the world. But this is also an opportunity to share in brief the core argument in his new book and its predecessor, which personally, speaking for myself, I regard both of these as exemplars of what's been called, referencing Boyer's 1990 Scholarship Reconsidered, as the scholarship of administration, with a heavy emphasis on scholarship. These are weighty volumes, more than 800 pages combined, I have them here, that as scholarly works, that are, in my view, as scholarly works with practical intent, and that challenge the status quo and chart a new course going forward. President Crow, Dr. Corey, again, many thanks. Fred, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Steve. Dr. Michael Crow is an educator, knowledge enterprise architect, science and technology policy scholar, and higher education leader. He became the 16th president of ASU in July of 2002, and has spearheaded the university's rapid and transformative evolution into one of the world's best public metropolitan research universities. As a new American university, ASU simultaneously demonstrates comprehensive excellence, inclusivity representative of the ethnic and socioeconomic diversity of the United States, and meaningful societal impact. It is my great pleasure, truly, to introduce Dr. Michael Crow, President of Arizona State University.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you, Steve. What I'll try to do for a few minutes is just sort of bring you up to speed on the logic behind the book, the thinking of the book, try to introduce into your thinking the notion of multimodal evolution, which is a strange thing within higher education itself. But before sort of getting into the nuts and bolts or the guts of the book, I just want to talk a little bit about American higher education in the following sense, and this is meant to make all of us, including me, feel somewhat uncomfortable. That is, the evolution of the United States from its founding forward has been an unbelievable phenomenon in emergent but not yet fully realized social justice, emergent but not yet fully realized protection of the individual, emergent but not yet fully realized recognition of what a true person is. I mean, the Supreme Court just got around yesterday to saying that we can't discriminate people based on their sexual orientation. 200 years after we defined the country around the notion that all people are created equal. So it's a slow process. It's also the case that, you know, I guess we have to accept the fact that we live in a country and are a part of institutions that in lots of ways have not yet found the way to fully grasp or understand the totality of what justice really means and of what equality really means. And so we live in a society with systemic racism and systemic bias. We live in a society where we, the universities, have done insufficient work for all that we've done to produce new ideas and new theories and new concepts of justice and individual rights, and to diversify and to expand and to evolve, where we've done many, many things. It's not sufficient. It's not sufficient because something's happened along the way. We have found ourselves somewhat off track of what American universities need to be inside an egalitarian democracy, inside a democracy where people are equal, inside a democracy where it is basically the product of our own enabling revolution, that your fate would not be determined based on your parents' circumstances, that your fate would not be determined based on your religion, your fate would not be determined based on your socioeconomic status. And so from my perspective, we have to continue to find ways to take really, really hard looks at us, our own sector, the universities. What have we done to allow justice to be such a difficult concept to fully implement and to fully realize? What have we done to create and enhance the social divide? We think of ourselves as the enablers of social progress, which we are, but at the same time, we are also the empowerers of the social divide. We decided that the coin of the realm for many universities is exclusion. How many people did I not admit? And there somehow that would make me more competitive. If I could have 95% of the students that applied to my school turned away, then I would be therefore able to project that I was very exclusive and very important and very special. And so, we found ourselves in a situation. I think The Economist a couple of years ago had a brilliant cover. It showed a family of people dressed in high income clothing from the late 18th century, and it said America's new aristocracy. And on it were the labels of highly selective universities on the purse or on the jacket of this late 18th century clothing. And the mockery that they were presenting was that in this democracy of all democracies, that we'd become British again. We decided that college was for the few, that college was only for a handful, that only the wealthy or the unbelievably gifted would have access to college. And so it goes without saying that the American system of higher education has done a lot, has achieved a lot, is an unbelievably creative and powerful set of institutions. So what? We haven't done enough. We haven't become egalitarian enough. We haven't found a way to graduate even half the people that come to American colleges. More than half the people that attend an American college do not graduate. We haven't found a way to take the generosity of the American population, the American citizenry, which has spent hundreds of billions of dollars on Pell Grants, cash grants to families. More than half of the people that have taken those grants have no diploma. They have no certificate. They have no product of the college itself that's useful in life and useful in the economy other than what they learned in some of their courses. It's unbelievable. So having said that, I began this intellectual quest years ago, decades ago, of thinking through how one could find ways to construct new kinds of institutional models for American higher education. And I spent years reading, every word that Roger Geiger wrote and other historians of American higher education, and then layer upon layer upon layer of American history. The emergence of the colonial colleges, the emergence of the first public colleges, the battle to emerge in the 5 attempts to birth the land-grant colleges, the unique combination of the British model and the German model that led to the American Research University. And in all of that, being completely aware of the totality, if you will, of the complexity of the sociological impact of so many forces in academia driving towards exclusion and driving towards this notion of excellence through narrowness, and excellence through small numbers, and excellence through something we've heard along the way is that if you have a big university, you can't be any good. If you have big classes, you can't be any good. If you don't operate in the way of the old Greek academy of Plato from days gone by, you're not any good. And a lot of that is, for the most part, hogwash, because it's not based on any analytical outcome. And so 2 books, as Steve indicated, the first book, Designing the New American University, was basically the why. Why did we need a new kind of university in the United States? Because we have very successful universities in the United States. We have very successful colleges in the United States. We have, as individual institutions. As a system, not so successful, not as successful as it could be, particularly when it comes to equity, particularly when it comes to fairness. I grew up in a family in the bottom quartile of family incomes. My family was Section 8 housing eligible. We ate food that was given out in trucks. I would go pick up our cheese, pick up our peanut butter, pick up our powdered milk. We were eligible for all public assistance. And so kids from my family background in terms of family income in 1970, when I was in high school, 1973, when I was in high school, in 1970, only about 7% of students from our people from that socioeconomic class ever graduated from college. Well, today, 50 years later, it might be 8% or 9%, no fundamental change. Only the country is massively larger. So what we've done is we've found a way to concentrate the benefits of college and university level education into only families in the upper half of family incomes, and in particular, families in the upper quartile of family incomes. If you take the country, for instance, and you break it into thirds, the upper third, 110 million, the middle third, 110 million, and the bottom third, 110 million, and you run every variable that's out there in terms of lifespan, income, educational attainment, health outcomes, or whatever, the upper third, 110 million people, are like no country on the planet. The richest and getting richer of any group of people that exists, the longest lifespan of anybody on the planet. All indicators are positive. It's literally unbelievable. And the middle income, there you have a few indicators that are positive, but not as positive as the upper, and then some that are stable. And then the bottom third, 110 million people, larger than Germany, the size of Japan, there are no positive indicators. Lifespans are going down. It's all pre-COVID. It's even worse now. Educational attainment is going down. Incomes are going down. And universities are basically, and colleges are, we did the best we could, when in fact we haven't done the best that we could. So the first book, Designing the New American University, basically laid the argument of why we needed new kinds of universities, why we needed universities that were going to strive to be both highly excellent and highly accessible. In some states, for instance, some colleges aren't allowed to do significant research. They're held back in their scholarship. They're constrained in what they can do, while other universities that are called research universities are allowed to do whatever they want, but with fewer students and only students from certain performance levels in high school and so forth. And so this notion then of egalitarian access, on which most of our public universities and even some of our private colleges and universities were built, that notion of egalitarian access as it is compared against the society as a whole, not within single institutions, but as a whole, hasn't really worked. And so the second book, The Fifth Wave, the book that Steve showed you, this book, which is just out on a perfect week, just perfect, coming out right in the middle of COVID, it basically says the following. It walks through with a historical, philosophical, political analysis, how we got to where we are. And it addresses in a key chart that you can see in the book, I'm not going to put it up here, basically that we've had 4 historical waves of evolution of higher education in the United States. The first wave was basically the transplantation of the idea of a British college as existed at the time, and only at Oxford and Cambridge within England at the time. Could you build small residential colleges around the idea of being clustered around faculty? And so before the revolution, you had some great colleges emerge at Harvard and Columbia and Princeton and Penn and a few others, not very many, less than 10. And these colonial colleges took on this notion of being America's version of Greek academies. because of the scale of the United States at the time, all in the mid-Atlantic and Northeast region, where these colleges emerged. They didn't merge into a university like Oxford or Cambridge, but they looked very much like the colleges of Oxford and Cambridge. In fact, Harvard was modeled after a British college exactly, and became the progenitor then of the model of what a college was in the United States. Now, wave one, Greek Academy, Colonial College, small school, largely heavily biased, men only, white men only, landed white men only, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I won't walk you through the history and the lineage of these schools, but this is a long time ago. These first wave colleges then began evolving. More of them began being built. Oberlin in Ohio, and Grinnell College in Iowa, and Colorado College, Pomona, and others on the West Coast, Reed College. And so the evolution over a 400-year time frame has gone all the way from the original Harvard College all the way to Bennington and others in the 20th century. So this notion in the first wave was the building of a residential college assembled around a faculty, almost always small, liberal arts focused, and in many ways the classic design, the design that people think of when they think of a college. The second wave that we talk about is the emergence then in places where private philanthropy and private energy wasn't driving colleges, and you'll find some irony in this. And that was, there were no colleges in the southern states until the governments stepped up after the revolution and then began the process of building colleges, initially in South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, and then ultimately the classic of classics, the University of Virginia in the early 19th century under Mr. Jefferson himself, was this notion then of the beginning of the process of public colleges that started initially, again, in the same model. Very elitist, very elite-oriented, small, nomenclatured entities. That then has continued to evolve also. Following state colleges, state universities emerged, like Michigan. Then ultimately, throughout the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th century, state teachers' colleges, more state colleges, more state universities, ultimately community colleges. And so the second wave of evolution began to evolve. And it's in this second wave, the state or public college wave, is where we have hundreds and hundreds of institutions presently positioned who, in my view, struggle. They struggle because they are now, therefore, unless they've evolved to be research universities, they struggle because they're considered often, and we talk about this in the book, lesser institutions, when in fact, their assignment is very much in the spirit of democratic egalitarianism, but they often find themselves under-resourced. They find themselves constrained, overwhelmed with rules and all kinds of things. And then in the community college realm, very, very complex set of arenas. But the second wave of American higher education, these public colleges, are also evolving on their own. The third wave was the first articulation, I think, in a significant sense, of a truly American idea. Justin Morrill, a member of Congress from Vermont, was defeated several times prior to the Civil War in the ultimate attempt to make land grants available to the state from federally owned properties, to allow those federal properties to be used as in a sense, the investment capital to start a college in each state that would be dedicated to the education of the sons and daughters of farmers and mechanics. So much more plural, much more egalitarian, much more accessible, as well as much more practical in the Tocqueville sense. This notion of colleges focusing on agriculture and engineering and business and commerce and so forth and so on. And so during the middle of the Civil War of all things, in the middle of a great conflagration of unbelievable scale, Congress, with the southern states absent and politics a little bit different at the time, were able to pass this. And then the land grant colleges got going, and a few dozen of them got up off the ground, famously in Indiana, Purdue, and Illinois, and Iowa State, and Berkeley, and Cornell, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Michigan State. And then ultimately, because of the omission of large numbers of African-American farmers throughout the South, the 1890 colleges, ultimately the HBCUs and others began to emerge as an effort with very little funding and very little support to now birth a third wave of American higher education, this notion of people-centric and problem-centric colleges and universities. All of that's tooling along until the competitiveness of the American economy and the rapid industrialization of the United States led to cities now becoming highly competitive against each other. And then an idea emerged in 1876 about the notion of combining a German technical research-oriented university model with a British colonial college model and crashing these two things together and forming a new kind of university, a research university. No public could do this because the politics couldn't allow it. Certain schools like Princeton and others were defiantly against it. And so three philanthropists stepped up. Johns Hopkins, and a group of philanthropists in Baltimore, which was at the time one of America's leading industrial centers, forms Johns Hopkins. And then rapidly in Stanford, California, Leland Stanford, and in Chicago, John Rockefeller, then all seed fund the University of Chicago, Stanford, and Hopkins, which then become the prototypes for a new thing. Well, then all bets are off. Competition is underway. Some of the wave one schools like Columbia and Harvard and Princeton reluctantly, but ultimately then transform themselves into research universities with science schools and engineering schools and so forth. And then some of the land grants like Illinois and UC Berkeley and so forth then work to accelerate their evolution into research universities. There were 10 or 12 or 15 of these that were fully operational by 1910. And then that became a new wave of evolutionary change in the United States. Ultimately 100, 150, in fact, most of you are at one of the wave 4 schools, either one of the original schools, a progenitor school, or a quick innovator, or a school later, even ASU, which started as a wave 2 teachers college, was never a land grant, never had any part of the land grant model, and then not until the 1990s moved into wave 4 as a research university. So point of the story here is all 4 of those waves exist, all 4 of those waves continue to evolve, and all 4 of those waves are inadequate. They're inadequate because of the scale and the diversity of our population. They're inadequate because wave 4 has in particular created a dynamic of elitism and separatism. It used to be that you could be admitted to the University of California with a B average out of high school and there was no tuition. Now to go to 3 of the campuses, San Diego, Los Angeles, or Berkeley, you have to have an A+ average out of high school. And to go to the other undergraduate schools, the other 6 undergraduate schools, you have to have an A average to get in. That then has become then and tuition is not free, it's much higher than free. And so this notion then of how do you ultimately then continue to evolve with a society that's now 330 million, 335 million people, diversity like we've never seen it before, waves of immigration, waves of social change, waves of demanding of access, and waves of making things happen. Well, it may mean that we need not only innovation in the second wave, the public colleges, which we do, new technology, new ways to do things. It may mean that we need the land grants that remained in the third wave to act and behave in new ways. And it may mean that in the fourth wave, we need research universities to do new things, think new ways, reach out, touch more people and affect more people. The first wave, the colonial colleges and the small liberal arts colleges, they don't really scale, but they can be much more diversified. Having said all of that, you can run the numbers, which we've done, and we've run the numbers very carefully. There's no way that the present configuration of universities and colleges is adequate to the assignment. They don't scale. And they're trapped in many ways in this model that success is a function of exclusion. Costs are going up, everything's going up. So then the notion was, well, can America then evolve yet another wave of institutions, a fifth wave? And so the book, The Fifth Wave, wherever it went, the fifth wave here is basically making the argument for what kinds of institutions. We did the previous book was the why we need it. This is the what. What do you need to build? What does it need to look like? How does it need to operate? And so the notion then of the fifth wave is that these would be institutions that scale, remain egalitarian, work to not only bring in every student that's qualified, but helps every student that isn't qualified by working with other colleges and other universities to get qualified. They do not limit themselves only to undergraduate and graduate education, but they take all of their assets and all of their tools and they work in a service modality. They work with the K-12 community. They work with the corporate community. They work to drive human capital forward at scale. This doesn't mean that this replaces the other waves or the other schools, far from it. We're so inadequately structured and so inadequately powered and so inadequately technology enabled that right now we're leaving so much low-hanging fruit on the table. It's unbelievable. We're leaving talent uninspired. We're leaving talent uneducated. We believe that for whatever reason, the coin of the realm is small, small, small. And if you can go to one of those schools, that's fantastic, but that's not going to be the way in which we're going to drive up educational attainment. We're going to need institutions in the fifth wave, as we've demonstrated at ASU, that are technologically empowered. We have 70,000 students online, which is different than synchronous immersion like we're talking right here. We have 70,000 students online right now who 99% of them went to college and never finished. Well, how do we get the 30 million people to be able to finish college, and who's going to do that? And how's that going to be done? How are we going to scale and work at speed and with agility? Again, it doesn't mean that the fifth wave, what I'm calling in the book, national service universities, it doesn't mean that the fifth wave is a replacement wave, because in higher education, unlike business, waves do not replace each other. Waves of change augment each other. And so the plethora of options and the plethora of pathways. So the basic fifth wave argument is, how can we build highly egalitarian, scalable, technologically enhanced, projectable universities that are not just about being in a physical place? Purdue University, in the expansion of Purdue Global, the University of Maryland with University of Maryland Global, Penn State with Penn State Global, project, and they project at scale around their core faculty and their core assets and their core activity. So the notion of the fifth wave schools is that they are technologically enabled to project. They're able to be, as in the case of the historic land-grant university, Purdue, which is now an emergent fifth wave university, they're able to say, to engage the land-grant university, you don't have to just only go to the extension office or show up in West Lafayette, Indiana. You can also connect to the university in hundreds of different ways. And so I won't belabor much of it much longer, other than the intent of the book is to lay the intellectual argument, the philosophical argument, in pure American, if you're familiar with philosophers, pragmatic philosophy, the philosophies of John Dewey, the philosophies of Rorty, the logic of the notion of American pragmatism and American inventiveness, the notion of American egalitarianism. And so the fifth wave book is about the need for and the pathway to the birthing of a new type of American university to augment those that we've already built. So Steve or Fred, I'll turn it back to you guys. And Fred, you're muted, so I can't hear you.
Oh, thank you. Okay. You talk about frameworks of design innovation, epistemic innovation, pedagogical innovation. Would you talk about how we might begin to think about those as in the fifth wave context?
Well, let's just take pedagogical innovation. So if our only idea of a classroom is the classroom at Bowdoin College with one faculty member and 15 students sitting together for all things, then there's no way to scale higher education to the necessary scale, because that's not going to be affordable. And there's no way, by the way, to then take higher education also at the same time and make it ubiquitously accessible across the entirety of a person's life. And so pedagogical innovation requires us to not throw out that unbelievably special classroom experience, but to augment around that unbelievably special classroom experience other learning experiences that also produce tremendous learning outcomes. And so that requires there to be a willingness or an acceptance of pedagogical changes that are realistically reflective of what it takes to operate a higher education system in a society of, what will be 400 or 450 million people in the next few decades.
And more on the epistemic innovations?
I think that epistemologically, there's this whole notion of how learning occurs. This notion that somehow, right now for the last many decades, and apparently some schools are moving away from this, we decided that SAT tests and ACT tests were determiners of college preparation. Those two tests measure analytical intelligence and verbal intelligence more than anything else. There's no measurement of emotional intelligence, creative intelligence, tactile intelligence, spatial intelligence, or any of the other of Gardner's models of intelligence or types of intelligence. And so epistemologically, we have to become more innovative to capture the totality of the ability of the population. And it may be that there may be schools that want to be narrowly focused around only analytical and verbal intelligence criteria. And it may be that institutions like ours have that and other areas to focus on. So epistemologically, I think that one's got to think through this notion that, college is not only about the production of a single track of intelligence or thinking. It's broader than that. And that makes a lot of people squirm.
And it's part of it is related to the difference between some of these big universities, and I'll go ahead and name it, the University of Phoenix, and what you're describing as fifth wave universities. What you're talking about are research institutions.
Yeah, well, scholarly driven and research intensive both. So anything that's a university, if you're not scholarly driven, you're not a university. I don't know what you are. You're an educational service company, but you're not a university. Universities and colleges have faculty who are scholars, who are highly capable in their areas. And so it turns out that there was an early, perhaps you could even argue this, attempt at a fifth wave coming out of the market, which were going to be institutions without a faculty core, without libraries, with just instructors that were just translating information from books, but no driving of knowledge forward as a part of what they're doing. And for the most part, those institutions failed. Not only did they fail, they were unmitigated failures. They were not producing high quality outcomes. And so this is what we're talking about in the fifth wave is regular faculty operating in a new modality. And so that's really what we're talking about.
Yeah, can I jump in, Fred? Would that be all right? I think our Q&A function isn't working. I'll check on it. I tried to post a question there. I was unable to, so it might be just me. But I do have a question if I could pose it while we're working on that. My question involves leadership. You lay out a vision for society-wide change, and there's a lot of history, a lot of pragmatism, as you said, other kinds of material that suggests that a direction that we ought to go in. But what kinds of leadership is going to be needed in order to realize this vision in practice?
The interesting thing for me was to find a way to empower the faculty and move them away from the simpleton worlds of academic bureaucracies that they were working in as little bureaucrats, just managing their turf, conserving their bureaucracy. And I'm using terminology from the literature of bureaucratic theory. It was all about resource allocation, an argument for space, an argument for capital. And so one of the things that we did was, unless the faculty could be empowered to be intellectual leaders and design leaders in plotting their own course, then no other leadership would work because there'd be constant conflict. So the empowerment of the faculty as intellectual leaders and as intellectual design leaders of their intellectual spaces, that was really, really important. That then enabled those of us in university leadership positions to then focus on how to speed up the innovative process within the university, and then to work with the academics that wanted to work in that modality, how to find technology and make it available. We have at ASU 250 degree programs and thousands of courses online. We never asked anybody to do any of that. We just took highly innovative, empowered, leader-driven faculties and gave them assets to be able to move in new directions, which they were able to do. And so the concept of leadership is not hierarchical or structural. It's about empowerment of each group, empowerment of the faculty, and then therefore the empowerment of the people responsible for advancing the university. And so it's a little bit weird, Steve, but I think it works. I'm seeing some stuff in the chat space, but not in the Q&A space.
So this is an interesting one. Looking at SAT scores and high school GPAs as the coin of the realm. And you know, we use those to predict success. We don't use them for admission necessarily, but we do look at ASU, we look at students' GPAs and test scores to determine how best to serve those students. But the question here is, do you see us eventually returning to our roots as a push for social justice continues? Can the land grants and other publics turn the tide and push for this equity and access rather than striving for exclusivity?
Well, absolutely they can. Now, here's something that we've done on that in that regard, and we talk about this in the book. So we say that the public university, in particular the National Service University, but the land grants also and the public colleges, that if our student body is not representative of the totality of socioeconomic diversity, it's not successful. Period. And so we have 40,000 Pell eligible undergraduates, slightly overrepresenting the Pell eligibility of our state economy. That then means we also have an extremely ethnically diverse student body like we've never had before. The second we eliminated the financial barrier for access to the institution and went to this notion that we weren't successful, I guarantee you from the work that we've done in the University Innovation Alliance, which I'm the chairman of, that if every public university in the United States had its student body representative of the totality of socioeconomic diversity, it would be unbelievably diverse in every possible way. And if we then said, and we have not attained this yet, but we made this as our goal, undifferentiated outcomes. We will not allow family income to be the determiner of your probability of success. That is, we will take every measure, every step, every tool to help every student to get through. Now, we have a lot of, I guess, lazy thinkers that think that kids are not making it because somehow they need remedial work. And they don't need remedial work. They need the right learning path for the work that we're giving them within the university. And so we've learned some of these hard lessons at ASU. So there are ways to rethink the model, and I think to be much more valuable from a social equity perspective. We've changed everything. We have changed the entire profile of our student body. 30 years ago, 1% of the student body here, not more than 2%, were students of color. The university was basically a white middle-class institution with a low graduation rate. And so today we are representative of the totality of ethnic diversity with a high graduation rate. And that should be the goal of every public institution. And by the way, not the artificial goal. So for those of you that may be on here that are only admitting A+ students from high school and have really high 4-year graduation rates and extremely high 6-year graduation rates, that's easy peasy. It's about taking kids that are qualified. I mean, the real model, in fact, back here on my desk is this is the catalog of the University of California in Los Angeles on August 10th, 1950. B average, a B in certain courses, no tuition. Think about the world if it worked that way and you could scale. That's what they thought it took to be in college. That's what they thought. And that's what we need to figure out how to do.
Okay, here's one of my favorite quotes. Fifth wave universities may be among the only institutions in society that are positioned to facilitate the conversations that are needed to govern the strongly held and often incommensurate positions of opposing groups.
Yes, because the fifth wave schools, because of scale, as is the case with us as a prototype fifth wave, you know, we have 14,000 students from Starbucks. I'm on the phone last week, or on a video conference last week, with Kevin Johnson, the CEO of Starbucks, and here's what we're talking about. We're talking about how to take every single employee, they call them partners at Starbucks going forward, and create an opportunity for all of them to have personal development, educational opportunity as not just a thing they might do, but as a thing that they will do. It'll become a part of their employment, a part of their life, and it'll become a part of the corporation. So typically in universities, and we got huge flack, you know, we didn't get a single positive article about what we did with Starbucks 5 years ago when we started it out of the higher education press. All we got was, you know, that we were somehow, you know, working in a space we shouldn't be working in. So that meant then that universities should just abandon all the people that are working. And so this notion, as the book suggests, is that fifth wave schools, because they're national service universities, will be working with industry, hand in glove at scale, working to solve certain kinds of problems, working at community levels, projecting technologically empowered solutions. Our ASU local prototype, which is now operating in Los Angeles, is an example of deploying in a technological web with human support around it, an ability for someone to go to school who can't leave their neighborhood. Their parents won't let them even go to the local public university. So, you know, they got into UCLA, or they got into UC Irvine, or they got into Cal State Northridge, but they still can't go because they can't leave their community because of their family structure and the family network or the dynamics of their family and so forth. So then the national service universities then say, fine, then we'll deploy into the community itself. And that means then having the hard discussions with everybody to make things like that work.
It's a good segue into universal learning too. So universal learning, radical access, entrepreneurial partnerships, and perpetual innovation and discovery. What do you mean by universal learning, and why?
So a few years ago, I was at a meeting, a thing called a Do Fest for the Emerson Collective, which was a meeting in Marrakesh, Morocco. There were several hundred people there, and we were there talking about big ideas and making things happen. And this Silicon Valley executive runs up to me and he says, Crow, I've known him for a long time. He was so excited about this idea of universal income. And he said, here's what he said. He says, we're gonna have to figure out what to do because we're gonna put everybody out of work with our technologies. We're gonna have robots and autonomous vehicles and autonomous systems and artificial intelligence, and a third of the workforce is gonna go out of work. So he said, what's your thinking about us taxing all these technologies so we can just give money to the people that we put out of work? I said, well, that's like one of the stupidest things I've ever heard. I said, you can give people all the money you want, but people have to have purpose in their life. And we should have every way for them to move forward with their life possible. So we ran back from that and I started thinking about this, and I said, it can't be about universal income. It has to be about something else universal. What's more universally important than just income? It's the notion of learning, the empowerment of the individual. So we came up with the idea of universal learning, and this notion that somehow universities, and it would have to be more than adult learning or more than short courses and things like that, but the notion that a person could come in and out of certain universities throughout their entire life. It didn't make any difference where you were, how old you were, what you needed, you could come in and out. You could come from work into the university, from a tech school into the university, from the military into the university, back out of the university, back into something else. So I'm doing this wave function because we wanted to create this way where the university over a person's life could be intersected throughout the life. And so that means then rethinking the structure and the pedagogical design of the university also, so that we could then access what we're now referring to as the universal learner through the services that we'd be offering called universal learning.
And what kinds of partnerships do you see coming forward?
So in that, we have partnerships. We have technology partnerships with companies that can help us to project, help us to deal with scale, help us to deal with individuality and personalizing learning, which is really, really important, finding ways to personalize learning. away from just the standard model, and then also partnerships with others, partnerships with community colleges, partnerships with some learning enterprises in the private sector, trying to understand how to look at this cluster of know-how and giving it some value assignment, and connecting it to this cluster of know-how and giving it some value assignment. So bringing all those things together. It also means finding a way to build, sort of a chain of learning around the learner. We should have some understanding of all the learning experiences and all the learning opportunities that anyone has been through, and then have ways to help them to augment their learning as they're moving through their life. And that will mean then having partnerships with everybody that's involved in the learning chain, including the companies, the government, other colleges, other universities, community colleges, everybody.
COVID-19 has certainly changed our lives, at least for the time being. But how does it impact your vision for the future? I mean, it's obviously changed everything we're doing right now.
Yeah, I mean, COVID-19 is one of the negative outcomes of high-speed globalization. And there are other positive outcomes of high-speed globalization, but nonetheless, all of them present levels of complexity. So COVID has illustrated to us how unprepared we are for disruption, number one. Number two, COVID-19 has laid bare the technology gap. There were so many Americans that didn't even have access to internet-based delivery, particularly in the K-12 sector, which is a disgrace in some ways in a country as rich and as technologically powerful as the United States. For us at ASU, COVID-19 has enabled us to be a much better institution than we were on the 1st of March, and that is that we now have 3 teaching and learning modalities, not 2. When I first came to ASU in 2002, we had 1, full immersion, on campus, face-to-face learning. We now have 3. We have full immersion, on campus technology enhanced learning, because we're plugging in our technology for our on campus learners. About 10 years ago, we launched a major effort to have digital immersion online technology enhanced learning, and we have 70,000, give or take, students this year that will partake of our programs in that space. And now, in the last 3 months, in a very high rate of speed, we've built full immersion synchronous, what we call ASU Sync technology enhanced learning. And Fred, you know this, I mean, last spring semester, the semester we just ended, we had the highest completion rate for the spring semester that we've ever had. We had fantastic learning outcomes across all kinds of dimensions, all at the same time while we listened to faculty who were flailing their hands up in the air saying, well, we don't know if we can give grades. We don't really know what we're doing. And so again, we were underprepared to project and engage. So COVID, on a number of levels. I mean, on the education level, we were underprepared. We've built a better university. We're moving forward and hope to be able to be as responsive as we can be to the needs of people and learners and so forth. We've also learned through COVID that we have a deep gap between those that are speaking science and those that are speaking with authority. And they're not matched up well together. And I blame us, the scientists, for that. I don't blame the nincompoops that don't understand it. You couldn't expect them to understand it because they don't. And so that means that we've done a really poor job of preparation and education for these kinds of things. We've done a really poor job to help people to understand risk, to help people to understand response, to help people to understand why you need to wear masks and why you need to do this and why you need to do that. That's back on us. The universities and colleges, in my view, are to the average American. That's the college over there. That's the college over there. I don't really know what they're doing over there, but some of the stuff they're doing is pretty good. And football's all right. And so there's not a deep enough mechanism for us as the academy to speak in ways where people can hear us. And
is climate another example of that?
Absolutely. Absolutely another example of that. We've done a really poor job. And so scientists are using fear in some cases to project their concern about climate. And, you know, what people want is they want to understand these things. And that means we have to figure out how to speak in these different languages. And we haven't done a very good job of that.
And that might relate to interdisciplinarity, because when we do start talking, oftentimes in academics, we tend to just stay within our own disciplinary perspectives.
Well, not just
we're
that.
trained to do, you know.
Not just that, but we have this elitist attitude about disciplines. Physics is the most important science. Economics is the most important social science. You know, what a joke. It's just not the case. You know, these are different fields and different ways of approaching things. And then this notion that somehow when we built our School of Sustainability, which is an outcome-oriented science, people thought, well, why would you do that? Why don't they just study chemistry, or why don't they just study economics? And we said, well, some people will and some people won't, but some people need to study things in new integrative kind of ways to augment our overall intellectual capability. And that is very important, Fred, and it just has not been very common.
And even within disciplines, we create silos and create a hierarchy of silos, and sometimes those are gender-based.
Oh, they're not only gender, the gender bias in academia is legendary. You know, it's unbelievable that it's been historically a male-dominated arena, and we haven't corrected all of that yet. And then even within the disciplines themselves, we have these sociological phenomenon that we're apparently too smart to understand because we haven't been self-reflective enough. We haven't gone back and understood, why are these things happening and why are these things not happening? And are we responsible for some of that? And the answer is yes.
Absolutely, yes. All right, a closing question, Steve, for Dr. Crow?
Well, you know, I was just in the chat suggesting that we had a few minutes in case someone who hasn't asked a question might want to jump in. But I'm fascinated by this. I think I go back to the leadership issue. You've touched on sort of internally what kinds of how you support people within the institution to foster the change that's needed. And also you've talked about external building connections with businesses and government and other players externally. As you look ahead, based on all your years of experience working on at the face of this effort, you know, what's your feeling of optimism and pessimism right now? Do you think there's real opportunity in the short term to see some dramatic steps made ahead, you know, to go forward? Or, you know, do you think, you know, what kinds of major challenges do you still see in front of us?
I'm very optimistic. You know, the speed of the speed of the whole enlightenment and the whole movement towards reason as the dominant path by which we organize our thinking is not decelerating; it's accelerating. You know, there's in any road there's bumps and drops and, you know, flat tires and so forth, but it is an upwardly sloped momentum in terms of moving towards higher and higher levels of attainment of things like our Constitution aspires us to work toward. You can see it every day. It's too slow for some of us because we only live for a short period of time. And it's certainly too slow for all of those that have suffered under the yoke of history, you know, for far too long. But I am unbelievably optimistic that things like COVID and the present social moment that we are now accelerating into will be just the catalysts that we need to outline for us the paths for further maturation, further evolution. This notion, it's kind of funny. Somebody said to me, "What are you, like an idiot?" You know, the American Research University is the epitome of all things, the envy of the world. It's the end of the evolutionary process of higher education. I'm like, you don't even know what the word evolution means then. You know, evolution is adaptation. Evolution is forward progress through adaptation. That's what we're doing. And we need to accelerate that. And the fifth wave is an argument about that. And am I optimistic? Absolutely, because these forces have brought us this far. I don't want to describe to you what the world was like in, you know, 1400. But that's not a world that you'd ever want to be anywhere near.
Given that, what do you think are the great challenges? You know, given your optimism, there's still challenges. Which are the top ones that we ought to be looking at?
The biggest challenge is the self-satisfied, egocentric thinking of faculty. And what I mean by that is they're too internally focused. And they are some of the most powerful thinking humans that have ever lived. And if they could just take their egos and just, as we all have to, and just sort of just contain them, and then think about what we mean for people that don't find their way to the college or to the university, and how we can reach. I mean, you know, now there's almost 8 billion people on the planet and 335 million in the United States. How do we speak to them? How do we help move forward? So set aside the internal ego focus of the academic and broaden it. That would be number one. Number two, innovate, innovate, innovate. The old models, they just don't work. We still have 25% of the kids don't even graduate from high school. Are you kidding me? If you don't graduate from high school in 2020, your economic utility, with some rare exceptions, is going to be very hard to optimize. And so innovate. And I think the third thing that I would add to all of this is just open-mindedness. We're not an open-minded sector. What could we be doing to, be better prepared for the resilience that we apparently need more of? What could we be doing? What could we be doing to be better prepared for, all the things that climate change might bring? Adaptation. And that's going to require us, maybe my last point, to actually work together, even within single institutions, but between institutions also, in which we're loath to do that. We're loath to work together.
Well, on behalf of all the Reinvention Collaborative universities, which do work together in a great spirit of solidarity because of our common concern for undergraduate students and their education, and that's something that on a daily basis I'm very grateful for, and it's wonderful to see. But I appreciate your point. But on behalf of all those folks, Dr. Corey and his colleagues and their colleagues at private and public universities across the country, I want to thank Michael Crow, President of Arizona State University, Dr. Fred Corey, our esteemed and very much cherished colleague, for organizing and presenting this wonderfully insightful and motivating town hall today. Thank you both, and thanks to all the participants who made time to join us today. We'll record this, we'll caption it for hearing impaired listeners, and we'll make it available to anyone who wishes to see it. Thank you again.
All right, see ya.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.